Don't be jelly. All right. Well, glory. How was everyone today? Hey, can you toss me that pen?
Was it the 20th?
Yeah.
I don't write the date in there.
Well,
I feel lost.
I can't check. No, you're not doing it with the brochure.
All right. Welcome to week 5 of Apologetics.
I usually
1.
check it.
There you go. Oh, you don't need something?
No, I just need it.
Yeah.
This is week 5.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're 1 week behind.
So,
All right. We are going to talk about naturalism this week. And kind of lay just foundationally, we'll talk about agnosticism, we'll talk about atheism after this, but naturalism is kind of the foundational, modern foundation of agnosticism and atheism, and they're a little bit distinct, and that's why we're breaking them apart here a little bit. But essentially, a naturalist, a materialist, a humanist, kind of all coexist in this realm here. And for a naturalist, God is basically non-existent. The world came from evolution. Evolution is the answer for everything. Time is the magic potion. If you allow enough time, anything's possible, you know. Man is the result of naturalistic evolution, and so he is essentially just an animal. And when we die, we just cease to exist. The world someday will go extinct. All human reasoning is basically the apex of all authority, you know, in some way, which is odd because I think I mentioned this already. But you know, if you believe that the universe is the result of random, unguided processes, then that means your brain is the result of random, unguided processes, and you couldn't trust it. Right? How do you trust your own brain? How do you trust your own reasoning if it's the result of random, unguided processes? Why would you trust anything like that? And so this is, you know, there's a lot of paradox, I guess you might say, in the philosophy here, because they consider themselves to be the most intelligent. You're an idiot if you don't believe what they believe. They're the smartest people alive, except for they believe that everything is completely random and you know, unguided. So how they depend on their logic or their reasoning doesn't make any sense. They have to borrow from a different worldview to even come to that conclusion. But they do believe that objective science is the source of all truth. And they appeal to science. Science has all the answers, of course, and in spite of the fact that it doesn't, they claim that given enough time, it will, right? It will eventually have the answers. And they'll even cite, I don't know if you ever see anything by Neil deGrasse Tyson. And he's probably one of the most prominent atheist naturalists out there, and he'll give these arguments about how science has all the answers. Of course, it has all the answers. He'll say something like, you know, you realize that we built a rocket that launched and flew directly to one of the moons of Jupiter, and it launched a probe. It went down and it touched the surface of Jupiter, scooped up some of the soil, went back to the rocket and came back, delivered it to Earth, and went on to do it to another place. And we know how to do all of this. We figured it all out. We're smart. We're the smartest people that have ever lived. And how can you tell me science isn't going to have the answers? Right? he's real dramatic and stupid. Because, you know, that still doesn't change the fact that science cannot possibly answer everything. It's not possible. We'll talk more about that here in a little bit, but it's not possible for science to answer everything because too many things are immaterial, and science can only deal with material things. Science cannot deal with things like logic, reason, purpose. That's not a material thing, so science can't possibly answer purpose. Anyway, lots of things science cannot answer. It's like having two different conversations, but a naturalist believes that there is nothing other than science, and there's nothing that can be added to or taken away from science. They believe that man is basically good, but evil is due to ignorance and society, right? Think about that for a second. Man is basically good, but evil is due to society. Well, what's society made up of? Men. So men are basically good, but wouldn't you think basically good people would create basically good societies? I mean, how does society become evil and corrupt people who are basically good when society is made up of people? Right? Again, it doesn't have to make sense. It's just what you have to believe, or else you're an idiot if you don't, right? So there's that. And basically they believe that history is really just chaotic with no meaning much at all other than the fact that it happened, and there is no purpose. And you should just accept that and be okay with it. There is no purpose. There is nothing after. There's nothing coming. There's no reason at all. And you should just accept it and, move on. Nothing to see here, right? So those are basic tenets. Now let's walk through some of them and kind of get a little more discussion in on understanding here. Okay? Even though naturalism in various forms is pretty ancient, we'll use the term to refer to a worldview that has considerable influence in a relatively short time in Western culture. Its rise in Western culture was pretty dramatic, and it has a very dominant force in this culture. The seeds were planted in the 17th century, though, and they began to kind of really take shape in the 18th century, but most of us have been exposed to naturalism through Marxism. Karl Marx was a naturalist, and naturalism, by the way, was a foundational philosophy of communism, of Nazism, and all of those things. And the reason that they were able to just murder so many people without care, to wipe out the Jews and or to wipe out so many hundreds of millions of people, is because naturalism, because they're just animals. And they're unsuitable for what we want to accomplish, so we get rid of them. If an animal's in the way and it's causing you problems, you kill it. That's it. It's just an animal. What difference does it make? Understand? They're just those animal Jews. Just kill them. They're causing us problems, and let's wipe them out. Exterminate them like you would a rat. It's no different. It's no different, right? That's foundational in Marxism. Marx and naturalism, it reduces man down to nothing different than any vermin or animal out here. And so there's no reason to place a special value on human life, because human life is disposable in reality. So real specifically, 5 tenets of naturalism. Okay, number 1, God is irrelevant. That tenet helps us better understand the term naturalism. It's in contrast to theism, which is based on supernatural intervention of God, right? That God created. But for the naturalist in many ways, and if you hear him discuss, and we'll watch some debates, but the naturalist says God is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Why would I even talk about God? There's no such thing. It's irrelevant to anything, right? The second thing, progress and evolutionary change are inevitable. Really like that term, inevitable, right? It's just going to happen. Here's what's going to happen. We are going to have AI, and we will implant chips in everyone's brains, and it's inevitable. You might as well just accept it. It's inevitable, right?
They already did.
Yep, they recently did. Yeah. Third, man is autonomous, self-centered, and will save himself. Eventually, we're going to find the answer. What's the answer? Well, we're going to go to Mars. The machines are going to take over here. We're going to need a place to escape, and that's where we're going to Mars. We have to be an interplanetary species in order to survive, because technology will have taken everything over. Well, why don't we stop creating technology? We can't. It's inevitable. Right? Makes perfect sense, right? The same people that want to go to Mars because technology is going to make it impossible for humans to live here are the ones creating the technology that they say is going to make it impossible for humans to live here. All right. 4, education is the guide to life. Intelligence and freedom guarantee full human potential. Education is the guide to life. Intelligence and freedom guarantee full human potential. And number 5, science is the ultimate provider both for knowledge and morals. And these tenets have permeated our lives. They're apparent, for example, in the media, government, education, and you need to be aware of it because you're being force-fed a lot of this stuff if you're involved in anything societally. Okay? So naturalism basically holds that our universe and everything in it is best understood through the scientific method. And that is, according to them, an ongoing process of observation about the natural world, and that because we're just naturally inquisitive, we want to know, and so we come up with questions and we have hypotheses, and then we discover natural laws and all of that type of stuff, and through this everything can be solved. So a lot of this started with Karl Marx, but also with Charles Darwin. And you remember Darwin wrote the book The Origin of Man, which did not give the origin of man. Actually, it just talked about how there were different finches on the Galapagos Islands, and there's all these different finches, and so if there's different kinds of finches, that means they all kind of evolved in different ways. And if finches evolved in different ways, then that must mean that we came from single-cell organisms. Obviously, I mean, just connect the dots. Darwin had a doubt about this, by the way. And Darwin, in his own book, wrote that if the fossil record doesn't bear this out, then it's not true. But ignore that. Do not accept Darwin's doubts, even though the fossil record has no evidence of it, right? Even though we have one-celled organisms, right? And we have multi-celled organisms, but we don't have any 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 40, 50, 60-celled organisms. You hearing what I'm saying? No, there's nothing between one-celled organism and complex life. There's just this big gap there. Mm-hmm. If you were thinking everything came from one-celled organism, shouldn't we have something in between there? But there's not anything, and there's no evidence of anything, and there isn't currently anything, and we still have one-celled organisms, right? And their answer is, well, it takes time. It takes time, right? Which, when Darwin was presenting this, remember, they thought that cell was just like a jelly, type mass. They didn't understand the cell. They couldn't see a cell. They didn't understand the parts of the cell. They'd never heard of DNA, right? Or the proteins and all that fold and all that. The cell is one of the most complex things in the world. The single cell is so complex. And DNA is super complex. But they run this test back in the, early 1900s, and they tried to recreate the potential, soup that was here in their mind pre, life, add electricity and all this, and it created a couple proteins, right? Well, not really. Created a couple enzymes. It was so far from even being a single protein, but they don't report it that way. They report that, hey, even in the 1950s, they were creating life, right? Isn't it weird that if they found a single cell organism on Mars, it would be life, but a baby in the womb isn't, right? It's just kind of crazy. But that process, right, that in spite of the fact that there's no evidence, in spite of the fact that there's no connection, in spite of the fact that we have the very clearly in the fossil record what's called the Cambrian explosion. We'll get into that more later on. But it's like there's nothing and then there's everything, right? In spite of that, they're absolutely certain that it's just because of time, right? It's just because of time. And it just, if we had enough time, it would happen. We'll talk about more of that later on. But nonetheless, they hold that our universe and everything in it is just understood best that way. Now, Darwin, his theory kind of really undergirded a lot of modern naturalism and provided the answer of meaning for human existence and all that for a naturalist for years. And it's really been widely held by society that the clear scientific truth of the origins of man were found in Darwin's explanation. And in later years, Stephen Hawking believed that he had solidified the theory of evolution using mathematical formulations to validate Darwin's claim that, there's a lot of scientists now that have come out and said, yeah, Darwin was wrong. We need a different explanation. A lot of them, okay? The problem with naturalism is that the theories that have been proposed can't be classified as truth. Truth, to be absolute, must be weighed itself against an absolute, which is part of the control method. And without being able to do that, the theories remain just that, theories, right? In practice, science should be observable and repeatable, right? We should be able to observe it and repeat it. Now, here's the interesting thing, okay? Someone say, well, you can't do that with the Bible, okay? Well, let's think about that for just a second. Well, the Bible says that an intelligent God created everything and placed his intelligence, through his intelligence, into everything, purpose and function. And all of it works together in a cycle, right? That's what the Bible tells us. Well, can we observe that type of a thing? We certainly can, because DNA is data. It's information, okay? And it's like massive amounts of information. Information comes from someone who inputs it. It doesn't come from any other source. There's nowhere at all that information arises from nothing, okay? And so we can observe that information comes from an information giver, right? Laws come from a lawgiver. And we can observe all of that in practice, and then we can look back and say, okay, so from everything we observe, where would this information have come from? Well, it had to come from someone that had information. It had to come from some source that was able to program it all together, if you will, using modern vernacular, right? That is scientific. In reality, that is scientific. You postulate based on what you observe. So the modern scientist and naturalist observes everything and then says, my postulate is that everything, all this detail, all this information came from nothing and nowhere and no one, right? That's unscientific in itself, okay? And they redefine things. You know, the reality is if you say, they say it came from nothing, but they don't actually mean nothing. They redefine nothing to mean something, but a really small something. It's weird, actually. But they don't mean nothing. They mean just a really, really tiny something became everything, right? And so they have to redefine everything. They have to change everything because their theory doesn't work and it doesn't make sense. So naturalism assumes that there's just no built-in meaning or purpose for anything. Human life, indeed every kind of life and every aspect of material reality are just cosmic accidents. The essence of reality is nothing more than material substances which over eons have evolved into what we see today. Now, I honestly, I was thinking about this the other night. I think I told the church this the other day, Sunday morning. I was thinking about purpose. Under the naturalistic worldview, there is no purpose. But yet, if you were to observe people, like every person either has a purpose or is seeking a purpose. Why do so many people commit suicide? They feel like they have no purpose. There's no reason for them to be here. They have no hope of a purpose. And so why live, right? Purpose makes life have meaning. Okay? And you think about that, just think about that thought for a second. Do you think dogs sit around going, what's my purpose? Rocks, trees, they just exist. Cows, they're not out there contemplating their purpose. They're not out there going, I think someday I'm going to be a juicy burger. That's my purpose in life, you know? They're not thinking about that stuff, you know? You know what they're thinking about? Thirsty, right? They're not focused on purpose, meaning, relevance, all that stuff, right? That's a uniquely human issue. Now, here's the thing. If everything was by chance and everything evolved, and this was Darwin's theory, the theory of natural selection, that the most important things developed, were kept, then why would only mankind have developed to need a sense of purpose? Why would there have ever been a sense of purpose at all developed, right? Accidentally, cosmically. It's nonsensical. If we're just an animal that's going to live and die, then a sense of purpose is contrary to existence, actually. Because once you take away purpose, you lose hope for life and you kill yourself. So having a drive for purpose is contrary to natural selection. And it's interesting to me that thought of the universal reality of purpose that men have is, to me, a really powerful evidence that there's a God of purpose that programmed that into us. Why else would it be here? Having purpose is something God put in us because God has a purpose for us. And that's an amazing thought. So my wife was less impressed by that thought. She's like, could you go to sleep now? So anyway, her purpose was sleep. All right. But for them, there's no purpose. It's simply up to cultures who are capable of contemplation to invent their own meaning. To this point, the evolutionary history, only man has ended up evolving with a sense of moral values or purpose. So only man needs to even deal with these issues, but he doesn't really need to deal with them because there is no purpose. There are no morality. other than what culture dictates. And ultimately, since there's no innate value or meaning, each person has to find their own meaning, something subjective that makes life meaningful and worth living for them. It may be different from individual to individual, but that's okay, because there's nothing that can objectively be called right, truth, purpose, or meaning. And so, what difference does it make? History is linear. It's just a series of naturalistic events, and there's no overarching purpose in history. It just happens, and eventually it'll end. And humans will become extinct, and everything else will become extinct. And we're just the product of the environment we're in, right? And what has come around us. It's interesting because in this perspective, man is just an animal. And so most of your modern psychology approaches man from that perspective. One of the reasons, I really encourage you, if you're going to go forward in ministry, you need to take the counseling classes, okay? It completely changed my understanding of ministering and understanding how to apply truths of the Bible. The reality is, and I say this, not everyone that took classes understood it and got it. That's just the reality. That's always the way. But part of that is Brother Hayes was, he was brilliant. He was really understood counseling, but he was not organized. And so when he taught kind of in a disorganized fashion. So he'd teach about this, he'd teach about that, teach about this over here. But when he sat down to practice, he put it all together. But when he taught it, he didn't necessarily. And so a lot of people took the classes and weren't able to put it all together, if you will. And so that's a totally different topic. But nonetheless, whenever you think about this area of psychology, understand that all of these secular psychologists, psychotherapists, they all approach man from the same idea, that man is just an animal, a bundle of chemical reactions. That's all he is. And if he's just a bunch of chemical reactions, then if he's having reactions that seem to be bad, he feels are bad, and or seem to be contrary to what's beneficial to society at large, then what you need to do is supplement the chemicals to change his behavior. That makes perfect sense. If man is not a created in the image of God soul, living soul, he's just a evolutionary, creation of chemicals. It also makes sense that, the way that they approach it, that basically we want to engineer society that guides people into being the normally good person that they would like to be. Pavlov and Maslow and Skinner and Jung and all of those guys, those are all different schools of psychology, but you experience all of them, okay? You experience them like when you go to Wendy's and you walk in and you have to walk through the little channel to get up. You know why? Because you're too much of a dumb animal to be able to form a line without that channel there. That's Skinnerism, right? You would all just crowd into a big ball. They wouldn't know who to serve, and it'd be chaotic, right? Because you're just not capable of yourself. Society has to be engineered to make you get in line, all right? So this is the secular philosophy, the psychology that has come from this philosophy, right? If you find yourself thinking that you have a free will, you're wrong. You don't have any free will. Free will would imply that you're more than just a chemical reaction. Your brain is just chemical reactions reacting to the things around you. So really your brain is chemically reacting to the society around you, and if you commit a crime, it's not really your fault. It's the way you were raised because of your present circumstances, you shouldn't really be punished. As a matter of fact, we really shouldn't even have bail for people who do wrong because it's not their fault. It's society's fault, right? I mean, society's evil. People are good. So if we punish people that do wrong, then we're just really saying that society was wrong anyway. So why should they pay society when society is the problem? So let's not have bail. Let's just, yeah, you got to take them out of the circumstances, but then you take them, you release them, and no problem, right? And if you think that sounds absurd, that's exactly what they're doing in every major city across America right now. There were people in New York last week, a group of illegal immigrants that attacked and beat police officers. They caught them, stopped them, took them in, and immediately released them, no bail. They beat police officers on the street, no bail. No, just release, no requirement to hold them, right? They're just released right back out. So guess what they do? They do it again. I think I heard this. I don't know if this is how accurate this is, but this was a politician that said it, so it's probably completely wrong. But I think that currently they're estimating as much as 70% of the crime in major cities is being committed by people who are been arrested for the same crimes and immediately released. They go right back out and do it again. They arrest them again, immediately release them, they go do it again because they know there's no consequence. 70% of the crime is the same small group of people that are just being released back out to do it again. And it might not be 70%. That's what this guy said. Okay. But that's all systematic of the philosophy of naturalism. Okay. It's not their fault. It's not like they have a free will. It's not like they're choosing to do wrong. It's just what they've been engineered and programmed to do by society because of poverty or whatever it is, then if you grow up poor, then you're actually naturally you're going to be a criminal. Everybody that grows up poor is a criminal, and they can't help it. It's not their fault. Okay? It's not their fault. Just because you grew up rich and white, all of you. Right? You too. So anyway, all right. There's some logic problems obviously in this situation. If everything you do wrong isn't your fault, then should you get praise for everything you do right? If you have no free will, if you dive in front of a oncoming truck to save a child, they shouldn't put you on TV, should they? Say, this guy's a hero. No, because you were just a product of your environment. You were raised, obviously, in an environment where that was the way your chemicals reacted to one another and were trained to react that way, and therefore, why should you receive praise for good things if you're not responsible for bad things? Doesn't make any sense, right? But that's how they think. You should get praise for all the good stuff, but you should not be held accountable for any of the bad stuff. The reality is very few naturalists are intellectually honest or consistent with their worldview, which, it's just a reality. But they pick and choose what they want to borrow from Christian worldview. They take credit for their good deeds. They want to believe that they're in control of their own destiny, but they're quick to say that, there is no free will. Man's basically good, but, things like poverty and ignorance make him do bad things and all that type of stuff. So, it's just really inconsistent. And, so there's no way to pin down logical consistency within materialism. Marxism, communism, and socialism are natural outgrowths, I already said, of the naturalist worldview. And evil is defined by capitalism, where wealthy oppress the poor, because in communist nations, there is no wealthy oppression of the poor. Okay? Just doesn't happen. and all their medical systems are perfect. They have no bad medical systems. You should know that, okay? So if everyone in society is equal, everyone will choose to act properly. This is foundationally where communism and socialism and all that comes from. Everyone, if everyone's equal, will work for the best of everyone and to the best of their ability. And everyone in that scenario would take only what is needful from the community and not have greed. No one in communism is greedy. None. No one. And if you think any different, you're a racist and a fascist and a Nazi, and you probably love Hitler, who was also a socialist. But again, logic doesn't matter, right? A French philosopher, political philosopher, recently, not within the last couple of years, said that nowadays when he wants to debate a Marxist, he has to import him from an American university. Think about that. But it has taken over in America. So the real goal or push behind naturalism is that it absolves man of guilt, which is the ultimate goal in a lot of these world views. And that's really the idea behind psychology and all that, right? It's just alleviate your guilt. It's not your fault. It's someone else's fault. It's your parents' fault or someone else's fault. So there's no guilt. There is no God, so there is no guilt. You didn't have a purpose, so your every problem you have is the result of society and environment and all that type of stuff. So since they don't believe that there's anything that transcends the natural world, they really can't believe in objective good. Therefore, in a naturalist worldview, there's no good or evil. Evil's relative and just a matter of subjective preference. That's why killing babies isn't evil. It's for the greater good. Greater good that you can still party. Because there's no good or bad. It's just like what's good for you, right? Well, having a baby would ruin your life. Really put a hamper on your partying and enjoying life. So greater good is your good, right? It's an important point that we've talked about through this course so far, is that a worldview needs to be logical. It needs to be practical. And at every turn in the discussion, we need to be able to recognize and point out where these systems we've talked about so far have to be bailed out, right, over and over again, because their philosophy doesn't really lend itself to practical life, okay? It creates complete disaster. So, it's the same thing we talked about when we said a pantheist calls the police when their car is stolen, even though there's no good or evil, well, the naturalist does the same thing. And once we pointed out that they don't have the right to ask that question, it's a valid question for someone to ask, because everyone has a built-in conscience and a concept of good and evil, even if they deny the existence of good and evil. So what are some possible answers or reasons for the existence of evil in the world? Okay. Well, one, it's necessary for evil to exist, for free will to exist, for free will to work, right? If it was impossible to obey God, then we would never have to choose to obey. I mean, to disobey God. I mean, if it were impossible to disobey Him, we'd never have to choose to obey. We'd just be like robots, and that wouldn't bring glory to God. And the reality is that evil exists in the world because there is good. You couldn't know good without evil. It's the knowledge of good and evil, right? If you think about it, Adam already had the knowledge of good, because he'd been given the knowledge of what he needed in the garden, and knew God and knew all the things God needed him to know, right? He had the knowledge of good. He didn't have the knowledge of evil. When he took the fruit, he added the knowledge of evil. And the fact of that is an act of that free will. It's necessary that both exist. If you remove evil, you also remove good, because they can't exist without. I'm trying to explain this in the right way, but we don't measure cold. We measure heat. Cold is the absence of heat. Right? We don't measure dark. We measure light. Dark is the absence of light. Okay? We actually don't measure evil. We measure good. The standard of good is God, who is perfect good. And the absence of God, and in the increasing absence of God, is evil. Okay? That's why it's important. God is the standard of righteousness, of holiness, of perfection. Okay? And so free will would not be possible if evil didn't exist. Okay? And yet a naturalist will acknowledge evil in the sense of people do wrong, but they blame it on the environment, not the individual, right? But obviously it's considered evil by them if someone has to take the blame. Does that make sense? In other words, if something has to be blamed, then that means something was wrong. Because if nothing's wrong, you don't blame anybody. You walk into a room and I'm like, what's wrong in here? Nothing. All right, who's to blame for that? Right? That wouldn't make any sense. But when something's wrong, then there's a pursuit of blame. So by the fact that a naturalist wants to blame society for the ills of the individual, it naturally requires that something is wrong. But if there is no God and there's no good and evil and right and wrong, then how could there be something wrong? You understand what I mean? It's just the logical inconsistency of it is astounding. So the naturalist, though, will say, well, what it is it's really just the survival of the fittest, and it's working out, those that are best fit for natural selection, they succeed and the others fail and are destroyed, right? Have you ever heard of the Darwin Awards? I don't know if they still do them. Years ago they did this. I don't know who did it, but basically it was this thing of an award that was given for people who died in the most dumb ways through the year, and at the end of the year they'd compile these lists of how people died, and they would make a list of Darwin Award winners, like they cleansed the gene pool from their stupidity. That was when I was a few years ago. Anyway, survival of the fittest. Like somebody did something really dumb. It's like, well, at least they're not going to contaminate the gene pool anymore. That was the idea, right? But if that's what guides good and evil, is just survival of the fittest, well, that's just a horrible guide. That's a horrible guide. Nancy Piercy said this: since evolutionary forces produced the human mind, then things like religion and morality are not transcendent truths. They are mere ideas that appear in the human mind when it has evolved to a certain level of complexity, products of human subjectivity. We create our own morality and meaning through our choices. Of course, we can recreate them whenever we choose. There is no normative definition of, say, marriage as a lifetime union between a man and a woman. That societal pattern is not inherent in and original in human nature, because nothing is inherent in human nature. Cultural patterns emerge gradually over the course of human evolution, arising by naturalistic causes and lasting as long as they are expedient for survival. Now, I'm going to stop for just a second. Did you hear that last part? Expedient for survival. Now that's interesting. All right, Michael Ruse. Listen to these statements, though. Michael Ruse, philosopher of science, said this: morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction and has no being beyond this. Wait a minute. Survival and reproduction. Wait a minute. The whole idea of survival of the fittest. Survival. Survival requires reproduction. So wouldn't anything that is contrary to reproduction tend to be contrary to survival of the fittest? So why do we want everyone to be gay again? Why do we want everyone to be trans? Isn't that contrary to their very survival concept? Again, logical. Very, very logical, right? Well, there's no foundational logic behind it. Let's ask some other questions. What about rape? Could it be argued, based on survival of the fittest, that rape produces offspring and therefore would be an aid to survival and reproduction?
Yep.
Okay. Survival of the fittest would seem to justify murder or genocide, because on one hand, we need reproduction to survive, but on the other hand, well, these people aren't good and we don't want them to reproduce, so wipe them out, right? One might argue that the most powerful or fittest aren't always bad, and that's true, but the problem is we can't be judgmental or condemn the powerful for being bad. When we do, we get our worldview as naturalism, because if being powerful makes you bad, then what is it that makes the poor bad? When they commit crime and all that. What about society? Well, what about society impact on the rich? No, they don't count. They're bad just on their own merit. Right. Oh, wait, that doesn't make any sense, does it? A little bit more confusing. Humans, are they more valuable than animals or rats or insects? If we're all just animals, no. My point is this, that all of these things flow together to produce a real problem for the idea of morality, purpose, meaning, or structure in the naturalist view. Okay. So many ways they just try and ignore it. I think it's one of the things that makes the moral argument, C.S. Lewis put together the moral argument, and I think it's one of the things that makes the moral argument so powerful. Okay. And I really would encourage you to look up and listen to C.S. Lewis, and you can find on YouTube recordings during C.S. Lewis's day. He did a radio broadcast over the BBC on the moral argument for God. Okay, this was sponsored by the government back in the day. Okay, it is some of the most fascinating. His lectures were fascinating. I really encourage you to read some C.S. Lewis, listen to some C.S. Lewis. You can hear him give the speeches on YouTube. The recordings are on there. There's whiteboard recordings of him and whatnot. It was a series of radio things. Anyway, it's fascinating, and a lot of this, what C.S. Lewis was doing was laying the understanding of how irrational naturalism is. Okay, and that's really what he was combating, was naturalism. And so his moral argument is very compelling, very, very compelling. Now, the modern naturalist will just say, yeah, the moral argument failed. But they're wrong. They have no answer for the moral argument. So in order to not argue it, they just deny it, right? Because they don't have an answer. There is no answer for the moral argument in their philosophy, okay? It's not natural survival of the fittest. Some of them will claim, something called a social contract theory, as long as society agrees and all that. All that stuff fails, okay? It's necessary that the naturalists borrow morality from the Christian. They cannot function without it, okay? The naturalist also cannot answer, so moving on, and we don't have a lot of time left, but moving on, the naturalist also cannot answer the question of the origins of the universe. Where did everything come from? They want to answer, evolution, and one thing evolved to another. But the problem with that is that, again, there is no verification for it. There's no evidence of it. There's no fossil record that would show it. Okay, so they can't answer the initial question. Not how did canines become collies and Dobermans and German shepherds, because those are all the same kind, right? Not how did felines become tomcats and calicos and lions, right? Those are all the same kind. You understand? That is microevolution. Microevolution, meaning variation within a kind. It's just like mankind, right? What does that mean? We're all of the same kind. Caucasian, Navajo, Choctaw, Asian, Alaskan, Mexican, Latin American, Black. We're all human. We're of the same kind. There's variations. Just like in all kinds, there's variations. There's only one kind, okay? And so there's no evidence of link between monkey kind, primate kind, right, and mankind. And that's the reality. I know, no, they have they have the head, Lucy, and all this type of stuff and all that. The problem is all of those have been disproven. But they still use them. Why?
Yeah.
Because they have nothing else. They perpetuate a lie that they know is a lie, but they perpetuate it because they have nothing else, okay? They cannot answer origin. It's not possible for them. So when they make statements about the reason for the extinction of the dinosaurs, they're guessing. They must deny the flood at all costs, which is literally the best explanation for all geological and fossil record is the flood. It's the best explanation, but it cannot possibly have happened because it says it in the Bible. It must not be the case, right? Ignore the fact that there's fish fossils on top of every mountain in the world. It can't possibly be that there was a worldwide flood, right? Their assumption that there is no God, matter is all there is, rules out the possibility of creation. In physics today, someone wrote, the first criteria is that any scientific theory must be naturalistic. Well, wait a minute. That'd be like saying any scientific theory must begin with a Bible verse before we can observe it. Would that be stupid? Is it okay to observe something and then go, oh, wow, God said something about that? That's fine, but not for the naturalist. It must begin with a naturalistic explanation. You can't have it any other way. If your belief is that God created things, it's not scientific, according to them. but somehow assuming that supernatural being did not create everything is scientific. So, you stack the deck and you make the rules and all that, and then, of course you win the game, right? In theory. But itself, naturalism is a religion. It's a worldview that dictates how you think and how you approach things, how you view evidence. You realize that all the evidence is the same, right? The facts are all the same. The real facts, are all the same for naturalist scientists and for Christians that are scientists. They have the same facts. What's the difference? Christian looks at the facts and says, that fits with what the Bible says. The naturalist looks at the facts and says, we have no idea why that's there, but it's certainly not the Bible. That's the reality, okay? We could say that the first rule of science is that God created everything and created an orderly universe and used science. Then we could use science to figure out how God made it, which was actually the intention of the first scientists, right? And we could learn more, and the more we can marvel at his ingenuity and his greatness. And our first rule would be just as scientific as theirs. In fact, that was the assumption, obviously, for the first 300 years of science. But when Darwin came up with the evolution as the hypothesis to answer the big question without any need for God, those that wanted to do away with God welcomed that theory with open arms, and they assumed that it was true even without proof. And they assumed the proof would follow because they wanted it to be true. And Richard Dawkins, who has written several books, one of them, The Blind Watchmaker, said Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Here's a couple quotes from the evolutionists that show that evolution really is a religion and not a science, okay? Richard Luton, American evolutionary biologist, says, we take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so theories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by a priori adherence. That a priori means at face value or before the decision comes. Before a predetermined thing. Okay, a priori. Where was I? To material causes, to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanation, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to you unintended. Moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine footprint in the door. That sounds satirical, but it's not. We must start with naturalistic premise. Michael Ruse, professor of history and philosophy and author of The Darwinian Revolution, Darwinism Defended and Taking Darwin Seriously, 3 books on Darwin. He acknowledges that evolution is a religion by saying this: evolution is promoted by its practitioners as more than mere science. Evolution is promulgated as an ideology, a secular religion, a full-fledged alternative to Christianity with meaning and morality. I am an ardent evolutionist and an ex-Christian, but I must admit this one complaint: the literalists, i.e. creationists, are absolutely right. Evolution is a religion. This was true of evolution in the beginning, and it's true of evolution still today. So at least some scientists are honest about what naturalism is. Yes, sir.
You kind of wonder if all scientists approach science from the basis that, create God is real and he created everything. I wonder how much further we would.
A lot of a lot of Christians that are scientists are making big discoveries right now, and that's true. But for so long, they were trapped out of the science. They weren't allowed in many places, and so some institutions have begun taking on, not secular institutions necessarily, but there are more Christian institutions that are given towards scientific exploration, and so it is interesting. All right. Let's see here. I got more notes than I have time. In October 2005, there were some articles on evolution in the religion section of the Dallas Morning News. Jacob Winberg said, but the acceptance of evolution diminishes religious belief in the aggregate for a simple reason. It provides a better answer to the question of how we got here than religion does. Not a different answer, a better answer. More plausible, more logical, supported by an enormous body of evidence. Post-Darwin evolutionary theory, which can explain the emergence of the first bacteria, doesn't even leave much room for a deist God whose minimal role might have been to flick the first switch. That's delusional at best. Okay. How do you deal with statements like that? Well, you remember that we live in a postmodern society where it doesn't matter if what you say is actually true or factual, right? The more emotionally you say it, the more emphatically you say it, the more right you are, right? And you can't allow people to speak differently, right? If they start to say something you disagree with, you just scream at them. That's actually what they're doing now. It's so, barking and screaming and all. It's just weird. So anyway, the truth is that evolution is not supported by an enormous body of evidence. In 1980, at the macroevolution conference held in Chicago, the paleontologists told the biologists, those are the guys that study bones, right? Told the biologists that there was zero support for evolution in the fossil record. Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard called this the trade secret of paleontology. Okay, so the fossil record does not support evolution. They never found the missing links, so scientists come up with what they call now, and have for a few years, what they call punctuated equilibrium. That's the new model. Since they couldn't find any transitional forms, the conclusion was that the change happened all at once. Just, it didn't happen, it didn't happen, it didn't happen. And then because there was enough time, all at once it all happened. That sounds oddly familiar, that all of it was created at once. Oh wait, no, created, just inadvertently happened. That's why there's no fossil record, right? But again, they have no explanation for how that happened, why it happened. It just did. Right, and how dare you question it, right? We could go into all those examples, but we'll save that for another time. Let's get to our test. Let's ask the question of reason. Does this philosophy, is it reasonable?
It's not reasonable because there's no morals. And if there's no morals, then how do you judge good or bad? Obviously, you can tell that people have a I guess written on their heart.
Mm-hmm.
But to a naturalist, then morals don't make sense.
They don't make sense.
And
that's true.
You're not. Who are you to say that killing someone's wrong?
Right.
It forces us to ignore 2/3 of who we are, our spirit and our soul, and only focus on the flesh.
Right.
It has a big focus on science and all that stuff, but then when they actually do the science, they don't listen to the science, I guess.
Right. Okay. Other areas of logical failure: free will. Okay. Purpose. In addition to the morality and so forth. Okay. They can't, it can't logically stand on its own. It has to borrow from somewhere else, right? 2, the question of experience.
I guess, do you just experience from science?
Well, the question would be, does naturalism hold water in your experience? Think about yourself and the things that have happened to you in your life. Are all the bad things you've done, are they your fault or everyone else's fault? The things that happen to you, do you consider it everyone else's fault or your fault? Or the person's fault, I mean. Like, for instance, if Derek hit me, mugged me, would I blame society or would I blame Derek? By experience, you know what I'm saying? So I saw this little clip of a guy, I guess he was a comedian, but anyway, he got mugged and he was up doing this speech thing and he said, I got mugged. I woke up, I was bloody, I was, robbed, I had no wallet, nothing. And the other big thing that I noticed, I was all of a sudden, I was a Republican. And I'm like, someone's got to do something about this crime, right? So his experience prior to mugging was, it's not their fault. Then he got mugged, and who do you blame? Society or the people? Well, both. He blamed them and said society needs to start doing something about this, right?
So it's more of a sense of personal.
So would your experience support the idea that nothing's your fault, that everything's just a random, that you make no decisions, you have no free will? Would your experience lend itself to the idea that you have no free will and you make no decisions? Hey, this is also a problem for Calvinism. A Calvinist denies that man has any free will, yet he makes decisions all the time. And again, go back to logic, if you're making decisions, then you're relying on your own reasoning, but if your mind is from an unguided natural process, then why would you rely on that? Right? And why would you even have the consideration, right? See, everyone makes decisions. You all decided what to wear tonight, how to get here, to come at all. You made a decision. You could have decided to do something else. So your experience demands that you acknowledge that you make decisions, but the naturalist says you don't. Okay, yeah.
I was gonna say what I said on the first one also applies here, that we experience our emotions, the soul, and we experience
Absolutely.
a need for purpose and spiritual concepts.
100%. Absolutely.
Deeper thought.
Mm-hmm.
They can't.
I can't answer it for that. Right.
In my experience too, if everyone is equal, there's still gonna be those that rise up, those that don't, those that mistreat, those that are selfish,
Right.
for themselves. And so, like the idea that if everyone has the same, then we'll all act right. So,
Yeah, it's
my
absurd.
experience hasn't never been true.
Right. And not only that, but historical experience looks at it and goes, okay, communism has never been successful anywhere.
Right.
Well, that's because it's never been tried in the pure sense. Okay, why hasn't it then? Oh, because people were involved. Oh, you mean good people who were basically good and had good intentions, so they implemented it? Or wait, did the communist society corrupt them because it was bad, or they were bad that corrupted it? Or, like it's just a series of nonsensical circles. Okay. All right, last question real quick. Practice. In practice, we can look at some individuals who have theoretically lived their lives by this philosophy, right? But have they really? In other words, Richard Dawkins, he's a naturalist, atheist, secularist, all that stuff. Has he really lived his life by his philosophy? Or is he able to live that life because of the Christian worldview that exists around him? If everyone lived by his philosophy, would he be able to live by it? That's the question, really. In practice, if everyone lived purely by a naturalist worldview, would we be able to live?
Well, just in him, he would say, I remember watching a video of him saying that live life to the fullest.
Right.
But if there's no purpose to life, then how are you fulfilling life? And I guess you could.
What would be the fullest?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I guess it would be
Pleasure?
that or
Success?
the growth of humankind. I don't know, but like,
But why would that be good?
right. So, I guess practice doesn't agree with
Right.
that, like you were saying, free will. 'Cause
It makes it impossible to function that way.
Technically, anyone that is a naturalist has already, when they start to be a naturalist, has already gone against what naturalists believe because they chose to be a naturalist in their own free will, which I believe they don't have. So once they've already chosen to be a naturalist, they're already going against that naturalism belief.
Well, they didn't have a choice. They had to be that way. Calvinist doesn't have a choice to be a Calvinist. He has to be because it was foreordained.
I was gonna say anyone who a society that fully plays out the naturalist point of view would have to be Epicurean and just fully seeking the pleasure.
If you esteemed pleasure as the primary thing that ought to be sought, but that would be again having to borrow from something, from another worldview. It would be reasonable to assume that.
Because that's what gets your reward zone and
Right.
serotonin and
It
all
would be
that.
reasonable to assume that, but again, you'd still have to borrow from another, because to what purpose? There's no purpose, there's no point, there's no, so even pleasure itself is not of any real value or purpose, right? In reality, if you take it to its logical extent.
Where would they base their societies off of, or how would they?
Marxism primarily. I say that's why communism, socialism, Nazism, all of them are Marxist philosophically, because Marxism is a naturalist worldview. So, okay. Anyway, some interesting stuff to think about. We'll talk about agnosticism and atheism next time, and we'll look at some interesting things there. All right. All right. We'll see you next Tuesday, except for all of you, and I'll see you on Sunday, but not you, probably, because you don't go to church here.
but
Sunday.
Sunday.
Are you gonna be gone tomorrow?